Novick,
Here.
Fritz,
Here.
Fish,
Here.
Hales.
Give Sue a chance to read that. Sorry. There we go. We have a single item on the calendar at number 811. Would you please read that?
811, amend Title 33, Planning and Zoning to allow limited commercial use of accessory parking within the Northwest Plan District.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We'll call it our team from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability to walk us through this issue, and then I know we've got some invited testimony and other folks that want to speak on this item. So, Joe, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Commissioners and Mayor. I'm Joe Zender, Chief Planner with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and I'm here today with Joan Fredrickson, who is the West District Planner and the lead on this particular legislative project. So what you're going to see today are some proposals related to parking in the Northwest Plan District. The main part of which actually started a decade or so ago when we were first working on the update of the Northwest Plan District. It adds flexibility in terms of how shared parking could be used. Initially, when this project went through the PSC, there were two sort of aspects to the program, both the shared parking and imposition of parking minimums for new development, and the Planning and Sustainability Commission only forwarded the shared parking part of the program. So you're likely to hear testimony on both pieces of this today, but what is being forwarded by the Planning and Sustainability Commission is only one piece. And before I turn it over to Joan, I'd like to also thank, this project was done in close collaboration with the Bureau of Transportation and Bureau of Transportation staff, both in the parking program and the planning program. So I wanted to acknowledge that. Joan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Joan Fredrickson with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Thank you for the opportunity to present the recommended draft of the Northwest Parking Update Project. As Joe mentioned, we've partnered with the Bureau of Transportation on this project, and here with me today I have staff from that bureau, Chris Arms from the Parking Operations Division, as well as Grant Moorhead from the Policy and Planning Division. So what we're talking about today is limited parking resources in Northwest. This is just a quick visual. So there's limited on-street and off-street parking resources, which makes it difficult for users in the district, commercial customers, employees, residents, to locate parking when they need it. The district also has an untapped resource in its existing private lots that go underutilized for some of the time, whether in the evenings or weekends or sometimes during the day. It also has existing zoning code language that is supposed to tap this resource, but that zoning code language has gone largely unused over the years since it was adopted in 2003. The code changes that I will go over for the shared parking propose to update those existing provisions and to allow better utilization of these types of existing and future parking resources, i.e. parking lots. For a little bit of context, we're all familiar with the Northwest Plan, the Northwest area. Many of us know it's popular shopping and dining areas. It's a pedestrian-friendly cadence of streets, but I want to make sure that we understand the full range of the area. So I have a map here. This is the broader geography. You can see the actual plan district ranges from Burnside to the north to Vaughan and Thurman, and then east to west between Northwest 23rd and I-405. So this district is far and away one of the densest in the city outside of the central city. Specifically today we have about 7,300 households and over 12,700 employees. We know that this area is going to grow and is projected to grow to significantly to about 9,400 households and over 14,000 employees in the 2035 timeframe. This growth, in conjunction with the historic development pattern of the area, where many of the old apartment buildings didn't include parking, coupled with the popular shopping and employment areas, continue to to create a constrained parking environment. The city's been working with stakeholders in the Northwest Plan District area for many years to try to find solutions in this arena. This slide shows the Northwest Parking Management Plan area, which PBOT worked on with stakeholders, and it was adopted in 2013. So management of parking resources has two main puzzle parts, so to speak, an on-street part and an off-street part. This is the on-street part. The Northwest Parking Management Plan begins to address on-street parking issues. They have implemented an updated parking permit area program and added metered parking, as well as creating a local advisory committee to help PBOT make informed decisions moving forward related to parking in this area. So some work is being done, some good work. Specifically about this proposal, it relates to the off-street part of the puzzle, the private property side of the equation. In an area with long-standing parking shortages like Northwest, it's beneficial to look at how to utilize all the parking resources, both on-street and off-street. The proposed code changes will help the district better utilize, make more efficient use of those parking resources, particularly by expanding the ability to have commercial parking across the whole district in accessory lots. A classic example of this is, as you can see here in the photos, is Legacy Good Sam. They have large parking lots that serve their patients, visitors, staff during the day, regular business hours, but they go underutilized basically largely in the evenings and weekends. So this is a perfect logical solution to create an arrangement where customers of the area, residents, can park after hours in many cases. And just to highlight where the proposed code provisions would apply, the red commercial areas on the map show reflect where commercial parking is allowed outright today. And the blue and the purple areas, which is the bulk of the district, the RH and the EX zones, they don't allow that today outright. And so the proposed provisions would allow accessory lots to be used commercially in those blue and purple areas. Specifically to the code changes, we want to expand how and when accessory parking can be used as commercial parking. The proposed code will create flexibility by allowing both short-term and long-term parking and expanding the allowed users. Currently, there are limitations on all those. Specifically, the provisions to allow short-term parking are seen to be one of the key improvements that will really make it viable and attractive for property owners to access and use these provisions and provide those parking resources to the community. The changes also provide an advisory role for the Northwest Parking Management Stakeholder Advisory Committee in reviewing the applications. Lastly, a set of administrative rules have been created to help implement these provisions, and PBOT and staff have worked closely to put these in place, and those are provided as an exhibit in the materials that you have. And finally, before I close, I want to mention the engagement opportunities throughout this process. The Northwest Parking Management Stakeholder Advisory Committee has been having robust and long conversations about parking and about shared parking in this district, and staff has been attending those meetings regularly. The SAC is comprised of neighborhood and business representatives, as well as at-large community members, and it's open to the public, regularly scheduled, so it's a good way for folks to tap into the issue if they're interested in it. Also, a little bit unusual, we made sure that we sent notice of this proposal to all property owners before the PSC hearing to make sure that people who might have projects in the pipeline or who had concerns about the proposal were aware of it. So we sent out public notice to all property owners prior to the PSC. We also held an open house and had information online. So today, we're here with the PSC's recommendation, and we ask council to consider amending Title 33, the zoning code, as shown in the recommended draft report for the shared parking standards, and to adopt the recommended draft report as further findings and legislative intent. One last item, we also hope that council will direct PBOT to adopt administrative rules for implementation, better implementation of these provisions. And that's it. Thank you. Staff is available to
Okay,
answer
thanks,
questions.
Joan.
Thank you very much for your time.
So, one question I have, that is, well, two questions. One, this is permissive, not mandatory, right? If a property owner
Correct.
doesn't want to make their commercial lot available for shared parking purposes, there's no requirement that they do so, right?
Correct.
And then the second is that, so that this goes into effect, do we know the total resource of those spaces, how many spaces there are? Potentially, that those property owners could say, "You
We
betcha."
don't have a number. We have, we've done PBOT has helped us do an inventory of where the parking lots are, but that's, constantly changing as properties get developed and
At least-
uses change.
It's at least 1,000, a guesstimate.
Yes.
Right. And then a third question, I guess, and that is, we're not regulating the market here. That is, not only is it permissive in terms of the property owner being able to make their parking available, if they want to make it available free or at a fee, we're not regulating that in the code.
Correct.
Okay, so that's up to the property owner as they see fit. Okay,
John, I have
other
a
questions?
We got a letter from Trinity Episcopal people saying the pearly gates will be closed to a number of the Episcopalians on this panel if we don't make the administrative rules a little more flexible. And unlike other letters and emails we got dealing with the parking mandate, this seems to be a very specific technical issue about having a sufficient time on the permit to justify the investment, what they're going to do with their surface parking. I don't purport to understand it completely, but you were copied on it. Do you have any feedback?
So the issue that they raise is that as part of the administrative rules, we have set up a recurring permitting system where you would get a permit the first year, for 1 year the first time, and then renewable every 3 years for these shared parking commercial permits. The idea with that is that we really want to make sure that that we can monitor the program and that there aren't unintended consequences coming out, and that it's a good way, a regular way to address any concerns that come up. So it's an opportunity for to have a renewal permit. It gives staff the opportunity to PBOT staff the opportunity to address concerns or make additional conditions with any permit.
So here's the
Yeah,
language.
So what's their objection? I guess I'm not following that.
So they're going to make a big upfront investment, apparently.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe. And because the current language says if the parking facility is found to be in violation of any kind, so it's very broad, PBOT has the authority to revoke the permit. And they're looking for just a little, I haven't met with them, I'm not their lobbyist, I'm just trying to understand the argument. They want some certainty at the back end if they're going to make an investment at the front end. And I guess, is that concern, since it is very broad, if it's found to be in violation of any kind? So is that any kind of violation, even sort of a technical one, or are we looking at?
I think the intent was that the violation relate to parking issues. I think the intent is if they are, because the administrative rules ask for certain information in order to approve the permit, and they also stipulate that you have to, make sure that you're not displacing your the users on your property. So that section addresses PBOT's ability to have the property owner address issues that come up without just, having a recurring permit allowance.
So I don't want to dwell too much on this.
Okay.
I would hope that in any system going forward, there's a reasonable chance to cure some kind of good faith standard, because it's a pretty heavy penalty. If you are revoked, you can't even apply for 6 months. So I'm guessing they want to play by the rules, but they just want to make sure that if for some reason they're in violation for some technical reason, they're not knocked out for a period of time. That's not your intent.
Right.
And I think that can be dealt with through something about good faith efforts and failure to cure any problem so that it doesn't come out of left field.
Yes, and those administrative rules are still in draft form, so we are happy to take a look at that again and refine that language to find the right balance there between wanting to be able to enforce any issues or address any issues, and also being flexible enough that property owners feel that they can benefit from these provisions.
Dan, please.
Yeah, I guess I had a question. I assume we're going to hear a lot about parking minimums, so I guess I wanted to get a question out there about, could shared parking be a way of meeting a parking minimum requirement, in your opinion? Either one of you?
Is that how we use them, Grant? I believe you have to provide the required, shared parking, the parking minimum requirements are for a number of spaces to be provided with the new development.
Right, and I'm saying, what if a new development was able to satisfy that requirement by demonstrating they have secured shared parking spaces within, I don't know, some radius of the new development?
I believe that we allow that, Commissioner, in the current.
Yeah, it's already
And what it does, though, in
Where we
effect.
currently have
Yeah.
parking minimums?
Where we have parking minimums, we allow that there's some radius.
Yes,
Okay.
I think for residential, it does have to be on site, but for other uses, it can be within a certain distance. And actually, we are considering changing those with future projects, but right now, that is allowed to a degree.
But you said residential is required to be on-site? I
Right.
guess that's what I was probing
Yeah.
about, is residential.
Yeah. Well,
So we're not doing that now.
Not under the current ordinance in the centers. We require the residential to be on site. And part of the thinking is this, is at what time of day are you going to, if you're going to lock up spaces that already exist for shared parking, there's a period where, the commercial spaces are used, and when they're not, on the residential spaces, especially given the research, I guess, that we did, you see that cars are stored a lot during the day because a lot of these are in transit-rich places. So we, at least in the first generation of this, did not allow that flexibility for the residential units. One
So,
could.
yeah, and I don't want to, I have no idea what it costs maybe to perhaps for a new development to lease shared parking spaces on a long-term basis to demonstrate compliance versus building the parking as part of the development. But it seems to me it might be something we want to allow. But
Well, in the spirit of why we're allowing parking flexibility, that would be really consistent. You already have a parking resource, let's optimize how it's used, and let's not overbuild parking because of the cost and also of the transportation impacts.
Okay, other questions at this point?
I have a couple of comments, Mayor. I'm just reminded that it was in the last year of the Adams administration that we were doing North Parking, and here we are again.
Deja all over again.
And
Yeah.
I seem to remember back in
We
2003.
were
and
working on
various-
it back in 2000 as
Indeed
well.
so. So here we are again. And each iteration, I think, becomes clear that, yes, indeed, we collectively have a problem and that we haven't solved all our problems so far. Bike Portland article yesterday said that there are 9,700 parking permits with only 4,100 spaces. So if the order of magnitude is the shared parking is maybe 1 or at best 2,000, we still don't have enough parking in Northwest. So for the purposes of discussion, I really thank everybody. We've gotten a lot of testimony, lobbying ahead of time. So I think all of us are pretty much aware of what the pros and cons are. I would like to move to put back in the planning staff's recommendation to the Planning Sustainability Commission to have the same minimums that we have elsewhere, which is up to 30 units, no parking is required, 31 to 40, 1 per 5 units, 40 to 50, 1 per 4 units, and 50 or more, 1 per 3 units. And then no required parking for other uses. So I'd just like to move that, and then I would suggest if we can put it on the table for consideration, we can then vote on it after we've heard
All
testimony.
right, is there a second to that amendment proposal?
For purposes of discussion, because I think it's a discussion we should have, I will second it.
Thank you, Commissioner,
So-
and that understanding. And also, I'm going to put an alternative on the table, or at least mention it, which I believe was suggested by Commissioner Chris Smith at the Planning Sustainability Commission. Another option would be to prohibit occupants of buildings over 30 units that are built after a particular date, to not allow them to apply for parking permits, so that people would be moving into those buildings knowing that they don't have a secured space and they don't have a parking permit either. So that's another option, and I'm just interested to hear what folks who've been living and breathing this for many years, which option you
There
prefer.
are some of those folks here, I think, so,
Yes.
yes. All right. Okay, so that amendment's on the table. We'll take testimony on that as well. Anything else for our team? Thank you both. And I know we're going to have a lot of people signed up to testify, but at first I want to call on members of our Planning and Sustainability Commission who are here, and I know Chris Smith is. I'm not sure if anyone else is from PSC, but thank you for being here. Thank you for weighing this issue for us, before us.
Thank you. So let me start with first of all, Chris Smith, Vice Chair of the Planning and Sustainability Commission. Let me start with the uncontroversial piece, which was the shared parking component was broadly supported. I think it's seen as a mechanism to make the most efficient use of the resources that already exist, particularly where there's counter-cyclical demand, where there may be one use during the day and another use off hours. We did add one provision to that as it came through the PSC, and that is that the SAC is the primary administrator of, or at least recommending the administration of that program. But if in the event that the SAC were to go away or become inoperative for some reason, and parking politics in Northwest have been known to go south at times, that PBOT would then take over that administrative role. So the shared parking program would survive potentially political upheavals in the neighborhood, and that was a provision we added at the PSC. So let me get to the more controversial part, which I'm sure you're going to hear about extensively this afternoon, which is whether or not parking minimums are a good policy or an effective solution to the issues in Northwest. We voted 5-2 against recommending parking minimums, and there were really three threads to that discussion. First is a fear of creating any unintended consequences around housing affordability. That was, I think, paramount in everyone's mind, given our current housing affordability crisis, that building parking contributes to the cost of projects, may prevent projects from being built, or if there is parking in a building that is not utilized, then potentially the carrying costs for that infrastructure get passed on to the people who are paying rent in that building. The other two factors that came into play were obviously concern about other citywide policies, the Climate Action Plan, portions of our comprehensive plan, that worry about overbuilding parking and the need to reduce the use and ownership of automobiles over time. TSP, for example, calls for a single occupancy vehicle rate mode share well under 50% 20 years from now, and continuing to build parking is not something that will help us in that direction. The other interesting factor is there are, of course, folks on our commission who actually build things and are worried about having excessive regulation. And interesting fact that I think is overlooked in this debate is that currently new construction in Northwest Portland is producing parking at a rate of between 0.5 and 0.6 spaces per unit. So there was several people on our commission who felt like, well, if we're already producing parking at that rate, why would we need to add regulation that produces 0.3 spaces per unit? The partial answer to that is that, well, there are still some buildings that aren't building any. So the effect of this would probably not impact most projects in Northwest, but it would take the option of building buildings without any parking off the table if there are more than 30 units. So I think there is a policy question here. Are you trying to address the amount of parking built in any individual building, or are you trying to get to the market in aggregate? As Commissioner Saltzman referred to, you could have fluidity of meeting parking requirements between buildings rather than insisting that it all be on site in a given building. And of course, the shared parking part of this proposal that is not controversial would facilitate that fluidity. So if your developer didn't build any parking, there's still the potential you could go rent a space in the building next door, which is not legal today, but would become legal under the shared parking component of this. And My name has been mentioned in connection with the idea of not allowing new buildings to have parking. I would give credit where credit is due, which is that was a strategy described by Jeff Tumlin in the parking symposium that PBOT put on last year. So I'll give Jeff credit for that idea, and maybe he'll get the pitchforks as well. What I would say is that there are other policy tools that may get at the underlying problem even more efficiently. The Planning and Sustainability Commission has also reviewed the Centers and Corridors toolkit that PBOT is developing. That hasn't come to you yet, but there are a number of policies in there that I think could be effective. I think the goal that I think everyone probably agrees on is that it is silly to have 8,000 permits competing for 4,000 spaces. Parking minimums are a very indirect way of addressing that, because what it essentially says is, let's go create some more parking that will cost $150 or more a month to rent, in the hope that someone will choose to pay that $150 rather than get a $60 a year permit to go hunt on the street. So, if you're cost conscious, the availability of that $150 parking space doesn't necessarily make you less likely to go ask for a permit to get the hunting license to go look for a space on the street. So the more direct policy that would get at that would be to cap the number of permits issued in the district. The great fear in the neighborhood is we have several thousand more residents coming in the next few years. Is that going to be several thousand more people hunting for a parking space in that limited supply of 4,000? We could simply say, we're not going to give out more than the 8,000 residential permits that already exist, and that would alleviate that fear. Now, that means you would wind up with a waiting list or some other mechanism to ration those, but I think some of my colleagues might agree with me that that has fewer potential unintended consequences than requiring the creation of parking that maybe nobody will rent if they're not willing to pay $150 a month. So, there are any number of policies in that toolkit that have been vetted through a stakeholder committee process, and staff is in the process of preparing for your review, that may be more efficient and more direct solutions to the real problem than mandating the creation of some very expensive parking. So I would leave you with that thought.
If I may play off that for a minute, we haven't brought the parking toolkit to council yet. The toolkit, we think, will include giving neighborhoods the ability to limit the total number of permits, to limit the number of permits that each individual person gets, because right now, the way the permit system works, if you have a license plate, you can get a permit for that license plate, even if you could own if you have 10 cars. And also to use price as a tool to regulate parking. So, for example, you could charge more for the second car somebody owns than the first. We haven't brought that yet, partly because I want to do some, although we've had stakeholder advisory committee, I want to do some additional public outreach on questions like, if we have a limited number of permits, how are they allocated? Are they allocated evenly to everybody throughout a geographic area without regard to whether they're in the residential zone, the mixed use zone? Are they put up for auction, so we just let the market determine? I think there's a number of issues that we're all going to want to hash out. But for right now, Northwest is in a position where they have a permit system, but they don't have a limit on the number of permits. And so what Chris suggested, it was sort of a ad hoc permit limit by saying that the new buildings without parking don't get permits. One thing I wanted to ask Chris is that if I think it's an intriguing idea. One thought I have about it is that given that the parking minimums only require a fraction of the units to have parking associated with them, then basically the parking minimums assume, in effect, that a bunch of people in those buildings would be getting permits and chasing spots. So if you wanted to create a permit limit that had the equivalent effect of parking minimums, you would want to give a bunch of permits to the people in those buildings, just not to 100%. Does that make sense?
That would be an in-between position, and I should be clear now that you're talking to Chris Smith, active transportation advocate, rather than the planning commissioner, because my commission has not considered the kind of questions we're verging into right now. But sure, I'm sure you could calibrate this in a variety of partial steps. There may be political usefulness of doing that.
Chris, let's bring equity into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I'll beat you to the punch.
Okay.
So next time Dan Salzman proposes to put a affordable housing development in Northwest where there's a shortage of affordable units, we say to the folks who live there that they're not eligible for getting a parking permit because they came too late. I mean, isn't if you're going to go down that route, shouldn't you ration them the way we ration Section 8 vouchers and have a lottery?
So I think the key word there is ration. So, there are only 4,000 on-street spaces in Northwest Portland, so we are rationing them. Today, we ration them on the basis of how long you're willing to circle your block or how far you're willing to park from your house. Are there more rational rationing mechanisms? Yes, I'm sure there are. So I mentioned a waiting list as one. A lottery could be another. I think there's some policy choices there.
I think we'd be reluctant to adopt a system that said that by virtue of the fact that you live there first, you have rights over someone that maybe is getting their first affordable apartment, for example, in that area. But let me go to the affordability piece. Because a lot of the materials we're getting is focusing on housing affordability. So and that was the first point you raised. This is slightly out of date, but the last time I checked on it, in the last 3 years, we've added about 24,000 private rental units to the market. 87% are luxury, so they're at the very height of the market, and less than 3% qualify as affordable by any definition. So clearly, we're in this unique time in the market where people are building the most expensive housing and they're filling it. So what's this affordability thing is important because it's something that I think you and Jeff Bachrach agree on. Whenever you and Jeff Bachrach agree on something, it gets my attention. What is the best evidence we have that the mandate drives up the cost of market housing?
So I think you're correct that the current rental rates are a function of scarcity rather than underlying costs. So the immediate impact would probably not be strongly felt. Over time, that's likely to change, and I think we worry about, or at least I worry about, two issues related to affordability. One is that I think there's experience industry-wide that the amount you can charge for a parking space itself doesn't always cover the cost of building that parking space. So you wind up getting a cross subsidy from the housing rents to cover the cost of building the parking. The other would be, again, there's this discontinuity between, the 4,000 spaces in Northwest that are available for $60 a year, which are, in huge demand, and the other supply of spaces in Northwest Portland that are available for $150 a month or more, which I don't think we have any data that says that those are oversubscribed. If you create stuff up here, the folks competing down here may still prefer to circle the block and hunt rather than pay, $1,800 a year. And if we force construction, more of those than the developers see a business case to build, then if they remain empty, somebody's bearing the carrying costs, of an unrented property, and presumably that's eventually going to find its way into the rents. So those are the two things I would be concerned about.
Back to Steve's point, but maybe the PSC is already involved in this. In the development of the toolkit, you're looking at potential changes to the permit system that include capping and pricing, right? And some of the capping ideas are not just last in or first in, congratulations, last in, sorry, but also total number or per household. You're looking at all those options.
Total number and some version of per household, which, so we could say there's only going to be a total of 6,000 permits, and if you have a garage, if you have your own garage, then you aren't entitled to one at all, or maybe you're entitled to one but not two, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I also served on the Centers and Corridors Stakeholder Committee in that process. Commissioner Novick is correct. We could adjust for things about whether you have off-street parking available. We could escalate the price for the second and third cars so you pay more. So, there are 20 or 25 items in that toolkit, and I would urge you to look at all 25 of those before going to parking minimums. I use minimums as a last resort.
Yeah, okay, get it. Thank you, Chris. Other questions, Chris?
What was the timeline for this again?
Well, I think that I want to bring it forward within the next few months. I think that we are going to need to have some broader public discussions about some of the issues involved, because I think that although stakeholder advisory committees have vetted these concepts, I think that they're going to attract a lot of public interest, and we're going to have a broader public discussion. So we're going to talk shortly about establishing a timetable for that, what that should look like, and I actually want to engage all of you in figuring out what sort of outreach we should do.
Given where we are in the comp plan process, it would be good to bring those in
Yeah.
at about the same time.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to take public testimony, but I think we should actually call on NWDA first, and that is, this is a one neighborhood change to the code, so it seems to me the neighborhood association ought to get first dibs. So if there's official testimony from NWDA, we'll call on you first, and then everybody else. So,
Maybe from the Northwest Parking Stakeholder Advisory
or
Committee?
from the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. So that- You may.
Have the chair of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee
Okay.
here, and I am the president of the NWDA.
Okay.
It'd be nice if we could sort of do it together,
Sure.
and if I can ask that our former president, because he's been
Sure.
active in all of this, can also.
Yeah, we just want to hear from those of you who've been volunteering on this issue a lot, and then we'll hear from everyone. So, thank you.
I'm the one who has the little.
And are we 2 minutes or 3 minutes?
Three.
3, okay.
Better get you queued up there.
It's mine, so he can talk first.
All right.
Good afternoon, I'm Rick Michelson, I'm chair of the SAC, and I'm pleased to be doing it for 2 years. And in case we decided that we needed sworn testimony today, I brought the parking Bible with us so that
There it is.
we have I've been working on parking issues for 40 years. In fact, when I was in architecture school, I developed a proposal for shared parking very much like a Zipcar. And I lobbied City Council in 1980 to eliminate the parking maximums, any parking requirement in the commercial zones, and followed through with the assistance and co-work of Gene Harrison in the 90s to eliminate the parking requirement as it was. Parking is very complicated, very difficult to deal with. These 2-minute sound bites are hard to focus on, so I'm going to focus on what the SAC asked for and some big picture stuff. First of all, the SAC, which was made up of transit advocates, people who were very opposed to parking garages and fought them bitterly, and people who were in favor of parking garages, unanimously endorsed this proposal to have both the shared parking and the parking minimums. The parking minimums were not established in our neighborhood at the time when they were established every place else. We had a lot of discussions about ways to improve the parking minimums, like eliminating the requirement for affordable housing, or giving credits for bus passes, or doing a variety of things. But at this point, what we're asking for simply is parity with the rest of the city in terms of parking minimums. We will work afterwards then to make them better as time goes on. We're sort of still in parking wars. On one extreme, there are people who believe that we should need to provide a parking space, an easy, free parking space for every possible customer on the busiest day. On the other side, there are people who said, quote, I don't own a car and nobody else should, unquote. My role is to facilitate parking in Northwest, which I define as making it possible for people who need their cars to park, not easy necessarily, but possible. I view parking as a piece of infrastructure. Public parking on street, public parking in garages, private parking in developments, all need to function together interchangeably. And we're moving towards that as we price parking on street closer to the off-street stuff. But as an infrastructure piece, we need to make sure that our infrastructure is sized appropriately. We need enough parking, but not too much parking. If we have more demand than we have supply, we need to both look at encouraging the increase in supply and reducing the demand. But some of the proposals that are going today are not like raising your rates $10 for a water bill. It's like deciding some people will have no parking or no water. We would never do that if it were water. So we need a way to allow everybody who really needs a car, and there are a lot of them, the opportunity to park. I think allowing some buildings to dump their parking load on the public is unfair and inequitable. You have a letter in your files from Tom Giera, a developer who speaks very much about that I call your attention to. And with that, I'll answer any questions.
Rick, is this your PowerPoint?
It's Karen's.
Are you going to address this?
Yes. So Rick, Chris made this suggestion that we may just have, we may have a sequencing question here as well as a policy call. Should we provide parity with Northwest to the other urban neighborhoods of the city where we do now have modest minimums? And that the sequencing point is try all this other stuff, or at least investigate all this other stuff of pricing and capping and other reforms to the pretty good level of agreement we've built over the last few years about these issues in Northwest. Try that first, sort of a Hippocratic Oath philosophy. What do you say to that? Why do minimums now if we're about to prototype some of these other policies?
Right, and I too served on that committee with Chris. I think the reason is we want to get in sequence. We want to get in sequence with the rest of the city, and the sequence of the rest of the city was to do these and then look at the tools based on having these in place. If we use the toolkit and then come back 4 years from now for parking minimums, we will have lost a lot of opportunity. I think it's timely. I think it is in sequence to get us coordinated with the rest of the city rather than, and then add the tools. We need it all.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Actually, Rick, if I may put words in your mouth, but feel free to spit them out. I mean, I perhaps see a lot of problems with parking minimums. One of the reasons I thought that your proposal deserved a hearing is that, in a way, Northwest has sort of done what the planning people and the parking planning people want neighborhoods to do. You're a dense neighborhood, you have a permit system, you have meters, whereas there's other parts of the city where people are not paying for permits and there are no meters and there's not as much of a parking demand, but they have parking minimums. So it seems to me that you have a reasonable argument that, look, we're doing all the right things, but we still have a parking problem. It's unfair to not give us minimums when these other neighborhoods that aren't doing the same things have them.
Let me answer that question in a couple of ways. First of all, what's different in the other neighborhoods is that you walk 2 or 3 blocks from the commercial district, there's parking available. We're a 20 block by 20 block area that has the same capacity problems and the same need and no ability to walk 3 blocks for cheaper parking. Secondly, creating new parking is expensive, but creating new parking in standalone parking garages is probably the most expensive way because you have to pay for the land and amortize it. So what I'm after here is creating a supply that potentially, in my utopian scheme, we could then lease from the building owners and distribute more equitably throughout the neighborhood. But if we don't have those spaces available because we've allowed 10 buildings to be built without parking, it's a supply we could never get back. I also think we need to look very closely at those parking minimums because I think they need some tuning. And I think we could get the function to make them work better, but we need them.
We just were able to just give you the authority, to give the SEC the authority to limit the number of permits tomorrow. Would that obviate your, so would that mean that you wouldn't have to worry about asking for parking minimums? You would just initiate the limits tomorrow?
I think that if we were to do that, the number of people you would hear coming down to City Hall to scream at the city because they just moved into Northwest into a new apartment building and can't get a parking space would be tremendous. I think we need to have more of a melding, sophisticated solution than just doing that. But it's clear that we need a cap on the number of spaces in Northwest as well.
Rick, how would you tweak the parking minimums? And is your primary concern that it's created a perverse incentive for smaller scale buildings?
Yeah, I think, and I started to do some work on this, but didn't finish it. By adjusting the percentages of spaces that are required for a number of apartments differently, you don't create these lumps, these bumps, and you may end up with a better parking ratio. It needs some work, it needs some tweaking, but I think there are better ways to do that than what we've got. I mean, one thing is you could say that there are 0.2 parking spaces required or whatever it is for all units except the first 25 are exempt. So you get credits for giving bus passes to people instead of building the parking, or a variety of tools, but they're all based on having a minimum to work against, and don't work unless there is that minimum.
And I take your point, Commissioner Fish, but I think maybe, I wouldn't call it a perverse incentive. It might be dumb luck, kind of like our requiring ground floor retail in the Pearl District that ended up creating the local restaurant scene, not knowing that we were going to do that. Creating an incentive for smaller apartment buildings as opposed to big monolithic ones might have been a beneficial result, even if we didn't see it coming. So I certainly didn't, but it looks like it might be working out that way.
I guess the point, the point I was flagging was the proposal for the mandates was a compromise position that we adopted as a placeholder, expecting that based on experience and further development, it would be refined. It was never meant to be the final product. It was a compromise.
Right, and we want to join that refinement process from the inside rather than having to pick what was happened after the refinement. You know, in our neighborhood, we're really talking about buildings that are 50 units or greater. So if, for instance, we exempted all units below 50 in Northwest, we'd be fine. But that's different, and we're trying to get it into sequence with the rest of the system.
Great, thank you, Rick, very much. Karen, you're on.
I'm going to switch over here so I can actually move the cursor. Okay, I've done a really quick.
Put your name in the record, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Karen Carlson. I'm actually here with a few hats. As I said, I'm president of NWDA. I'm also on the parking SAC, and I'm also kind of a number dweeb. So I'm here really to give you a bunch of numbers that you can use as you progress along. So let's see if I can do this. Okay. Back in 2013, I testified for parking minimums. And when I did that, I brought in a little example. So some of you might remember this little picture. I said, here's a project that's just about to come online. It's got this many units, and I believe it's going to have this much of a parking impact on the street. And physically, this is what it looks like. It looks like it's taking up 18 of the 28 block faces that are around it. So parking takes up a lot of space that we don't really have on the street available. I was off by one, by the way. It's now up and running. It's really a lot of ways the cumulative effect that these projects are having. The one I just talked about with 104 units is over on the right. There's another building that was built around the same time, 90 units. It has 63 parking passes. And we have 3 more that are in construction right now that are probably going to open within the next couple of months that are 49, 126, and 58. That's, I don't know how many passes they're each going to have, although I have to say the 126 is the one that has no parking. But it is going to impact, and there's just only so much space out there. And thank you, Commissioner.
And by passes, you mean on-street parking?
On-street parking
permits?
passes,
Okay.
yes, sorry. Thank you, Commissioner Fritz, for pointing this out. We have 4,100 on-street spaces for people to park with passes. We have some more that are just for visitors, like 21st and 23rd. Right now, we have basically 4,100 residential permits, and on top of that, we have like 1,200 guest permits, 4,300 employee permits, and as I see each building come online, even if we had minimum parking standards, even if we were down to 0.5 vehicles per household, we would still be having more passes now on the street than we actually have parking spaces. So I see that parking minimums as a little bit of a tourniquet to stop the intense bleeding. We've heard a lot about that the parking causes rents to go up. What we're finding in Northwest is there really isn't a very good correlation of that. This lists a number of buildings. I just went in a few days ago to look for a studio apartment in Northwest Portland in a new building, and they ranged in rent from $1,560 to about $1,200. The 900, by the way, is Footprint. That's that project that's, buildings with shared kitchens.
Are these studios all comparable? I mean, in terms of square footage and things like that?
Pretty close to the same square footage. There will be a lot of differences that you're going to see. Some places might, the cheaper might be the bad view, and the more expensive might be a better view.
But your point is whether it's a 300, 400, or 500 square foot studio, in these examples, whether there's parking or not, the market is roughly the same. Which is one of the things I to go back to the data I cited earlier. I think we may be in a market where you can get the same amount with or without parking if you push the limit.
And I do agree that the market is really controlling a lot of this right now. When you've got more demand than you have supply, people are going to get as much as they possibly can out of it. Anyway, I just wanted to see some.
So I need you to wrap up. Commissioner
Yeah,
Fish
I
dove into your time, so I'll give you some more.
Okay, very quickly, we've heard about capping and pricing to increase availability. I do want to point out that even though people think Northwest is really wealthy, the 2013 median income of the core part of our neighborhood is $30,000 to $35,000, and they have 0.7 cars per household. What we're asking, of course, is for you to adopt minimum parking standards along with, of course, adopting the shared parking, which everybody loves. And we really need every tool out there to get our parking into control. There's too much demand, and we can't seem to get people to give up their cars very easily. Thank you.
Some people, anyway. Thank you. Go ahead, Tavo.
Hi there. Rick and Karen did a great job, so there might be a little bit of overlap with my testimony, but I'll try to go quickly. Good afternoon. My name is Gustavo Cruz, and I'm speaking today on behalf of the Northwest District Association, the Northwest Parking Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and as a lifetime resident of Northwest Portland. First, I'd like to thank the council and city staff for devoting your time and energy to the parking situation in Northwest Portland. As you know, parking has been a challenge in our neighborhood for many years, and the accelerating pace of residential development has made our problem even more acute. Second, I'm here today to advocate for the adoption of parking minimums in Northwest Portland. As you weigh the alternatives, I would like to encourage you to consider the following key points. First, there appears to be minimal correlation, if any, between the ratio of parking spaces provided to new units and monthly rent. Affordable housing advocates are adamant that requiring parking increases the cost of housing. However, actual pricing reflects a number of factors, and the practical reality is, as Commissioner Fish just mentioned, that rents are about the same in Northwest Portland with or without parking. So the net economic benefit of pushing the parking burden to the streets primarily accrues to developers and not to those who are seeking affordable housing. You'll also note that Commissioner Smith, just a few moments ago, said that scarcity is what's driving rents, not cost. To the sequencing question that Mayor Hales just asked, I would note that the recently established Northwest Parking Plan has generated modest gains in on-street availability, but they will soon be wiped out if hundreds of additional units are built with off-street parking. The parking plan was a hard-fought win for both neighbors and business owners in Northwest Portland, and it would be a shame to lose those modest results by irresponsible developers who have no long-term interest in the neighborhood. Next, cars are a fact of life, and to some extent, they must be accommodated. Demand management strategies and market-based approaches are excellent tools, but it will take years of effort and increased investment in public transportation to modify behavior. Despite Portland's progressive transit culture, some percentage of new residents, most likely around 70%, will own and operate vehicles. If we don't plan ahead and provide some off-street parking resources for those individuals, our dysfunctional parking situation will further deteriorate. Next, all tools need to be applied, including parking minimums. There's no magic bullet for this problem, and we need all of the available tools to succeed. Demand management, shared parking, caps on permits to be issued, and parking minimums for new residential construction. Finally, fairness. Ironically, parking minimums were adopted in virtually every neighborhood in Portland except for Northwest Portland, which arguably needs additional parking resources more than any other neighborhood. It is simply not fair to existing residents and businesses to allow significant new development to occur with little or no additional parking. Please note that the NWDA's Planning Committee, the Northwest Portland Parking Stakeholder Advisory Committee, the Nob Hill Business Association, and city staff are all in favor of parking minimums for our neighborhood. This is the rare neighborhood issue on which there is near unanimous agreement. Thank you for your time and consideration.
So let me push back on you a little bit about one of the assumptions here, and that is, I'm not sure that we got it right in our parking minimums that we've applied elsewhere. So I'm glad people are ready to revisit the particulars of that, because it was a little bit of a shot of, let's try this. As Commissioner Fish said, it was never intended to be, holy writ for all time. It was an attempt to rebalance in a rapidly changing housing market, which has continued to rapidly change. But we did hear the argument that sort of, one of these days we'll have transit nirvana here on Division or Belmont, but we don't yet. Well, if there's one place in the city where you could say we were kind of there. It's this neighborhood where we built a $200 million streetcar network. So what part of transit don't you have yet is the playful way to ask the question. I mean, we do have excellent transit service. It is walkable to downtown. It is considered part of the central city, and you have the streetcar. It's frankly, I don't think it's going to get much better than that in terms of transit in our lifetime, given that there's a lot of the city that doesn't have streetcar yet. So what's nirvana look like, transit nirvana look like if you're not living in it already?
So I think that's the point exactly. I mean, if we've got the best transit system in the area, and we still have a 0.7 car ownership percentage throughout the densest part of the neighborhood. In the whole neighborhood, it's 1.04. Maybe this is the best we're going to get, is that 3/4 of people own cars instead of 100% of them.
I would just note that as a practical matter, what people do, of course, is they do use transit, but they also have a car. So they ride the streetcar or they ride the bus to work. They leave a car parked on the street or a car parked somewhere else, but they don't want to give up their car to run errands on the weekend or go to the coast or do whatever it is they have to do to pick up their kids after school or do these other things. People still feel somewhat tethered to their vehicles, even though they might have transit available to some degree.
Let me ask you something, Gustavo. If cost wasn't the driver, and I'm on the fence on that issue. I think you could make a case either way, but I'm not sure it's as conclusive as some people have suggested. In 5-10 years from now, if all the vehicles on the road were electric, will we be having this debate?
Sure, we still need a place to store them.
No, but I mean, we wouldn't be necessarily talking about the carbon impact. I mean, under the climate action plan.
Correct. Yes, if all these cars were electric, we would be talking simply about a parking problem and a lack of spaces rather than an environmental.
Actually, if we're still using coal as a big part of our electricity or even natural gas, that still has a carbon
But
impact.
there could be panels on the roof and.
But at least we talk
There
about
could be
having
more-
bike parking in apartment buildings because we have to make room for bikes. I mean, it is a slightly different art. I've never heard someone say there's too much bike parking in a vehicle.
No, and there'll be, I think the trend, long term, I think all of us are in agreement that the trend will be away from vehicles over in the long term. But what we're talking about is over the next, 5 to 10 years, as we have hundreds and maybe thousands of new people moving to the neighborhood, how do we accommodate that? And right now, the danger that I see and what really concerns me is that we spent years and years and years trying to put together the Northwest Parking Plan. We've got some modest gains from it. And I think they're in danger of evaporating very, very soon. We have a 120-unit building going in on 19th and Overton with 0 parking. I mean, that is outrageous to me. And think about the impact on neighbors around that building who are unlucky enough not to have off-street parking. I mean, it's a nightmare.
But if we build the parking spaces now, they'll be around for more than just the next 5 or 10 years. I mean, what I wonder about is self-driving vehicles. I mean, it seems like the way we're going, 10 years from now, everybody might have a part ownership in a self-driving vehicle that basically never has to park. It drops you off and then it goes takes somebody else somewhere, it never parks at all. So there's no danger of overbuilding parking in light of an era where we might not need it.
I think when we're talking about a population increase in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 6,000 people, and we're talking about under these ratios of creating maybe 1,000 parking spaces, there's no doubt that the population increase is going to outstrip the parking increase by a good factor. And it's just going to increase the parking supply this much, and the demand, even if the demand gets lower, it's still going to exceed that number of spaces.
Transit and self-driving cars assume that you're going to be wanting to go from the point that somebody is at to another given point. It's a nightmare to get from deep northwest to southwest after hours because the buses go downtown. So there's always going to be a need for cars, I believe.
Mayor, you know that I've been working in promoting transportation for years, working in light rail, streetcar. I've always assumed through all those years that as we increased the access to transit, people would get out of their cars. And they've been getting out of their cars. They just haven't been getting rid of their cars. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how to do that yet. But if we could do that, there's a lot of cars stored in Northwest Portland on the street.
Aren't getting used very much, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
But if we had minimums that we with the shared parking rules, we allowed them to be used more flexibly and creatively, couldn't we revisit, couldn't we revisit this in 10 to 15 years, and if there was surplus, come up with a different use for that space? I mean, one thing I will say as someone who's looked at some apartment buildings recently, there's a great shortage of storage units in apartment buildings. And a lot of people who are downsizing would like to have a place to store some stuff on site because it's expensive off-site. I mean, couldn't there be some scenario where we would build in a adaptation or a change in use in the future if market conditions change?
Absolutely. But on the other hand, if we don't build the spaces now, we can never build them. So they won't be there to convert. So we need to get ahead of this and not behind it.
You know, several of the places in Northwest that have built parking, they're not all underground. Some of them are like half of the first floor of a building, very easily converted.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's turn to the sign-up sheet, please.
We have 27 who've signed up to testify. Would the first three come up, please? Margot Black, Charlie So, and, Tori Jordan. They'll be followed by Ted Timmons, Rachel Shadone, and Eben Heitman.
Good afternoon. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Margot Black, and I am here as a renter, a mother with 3 kids. I have 2 cars. My family has 2 cars anyway, and I am coming to speak out against the minimum parking requirements because we are in the midst of an unprecedented housing crisis, and I think that anything that increases the cost of housing and restricts the supply is something that should be avoided at all costs. I've heard some compelling arguments that perhaps the increase in the development cost is not saving the renter any money, and that may be the case right now, but it does create a floor on what those rents can be. I mean, it certainly does increase the building cost, which, you know, we can't disappear any other way besides passing that on to the renters at some point. I really see this parking quagmire as being part of our growing pains of going from, small town to a big city. And really one piece of those growing pains is that we have to cut our addiction to cars. I mean, we hear over and over and over about folks or the population growth coming into the city, and we're just not going to be able to accommodate all those cars. And just like when people move to New York City and San Francisco, they don't imagine having a car there. I think that is what we need to envision in Portland. I personally think that, the parking and traffic situation is awful. We can't get anywhere in town anymore in under 40 minutes unless it's, 2 a.m. So I got a bike. My daughter just moved to a building downtown by PSU that doesn't have any parking. She got her driver's license the day after she turned 16. I couldn't stop her from getting a car. She's selling her car, so we are making choices that are informed by the fact that parking is expensive and hard to find and traffic is awful. But basically, if we build it, they'll come, right? I mean, I'm not going to move to a building right now that doesn't have parking, but that doesn't mean that there aren't buildings that have parking. And so I think that if we're building buildings that don't have parking, people are going to move into that knowledgeable about those buildings not having parking. It's not like there aren't any choices for them, especially if they're willing to pay those premium rents for those studios in Northwest. So I don't think that people are being forced to have cars or being forced to move into buildings with no parking and get on-street parking. I think that we need to, I think building the parking now and repurposing it later is exactly the way to slow our cutting our addiction from cars. And I just want to say, as a renter and a parent with cars, I absolutely am opposed to the minimum parking requirements.
Margot, can I ask you something? What did you think about the idea of, instead of parking minimums, limiting the number of permits that those new buildings get? I mean, on the one hand, obviously, it's discriminating against new people as opposed to old, but on the other hand, ultimately, I think we are going to have to limit the number of permits, and there's not going to be any perfect way. Would you think it would be acceptable or unacceptably discriminatory to say, for new buildings above a certain size, we will distribute, parking permits for that permit area to half the people rather than all of them, or something like that?
I think that's fine. I mean, I think anything we are doing to limit the amount, to prioritize making room for people over cars is a good thing. And if limiting parking permits is a way to do that, that's fine. I do think that, and Commissioner Fish brought up the equity lens. I think there are going to be folks who move in, possibly with disabilities or elderly, or they, suffer an injury, or for whatever reason, they need to have access to a car. And I hope that any limiting of permits like that will have a mechanism for folks to obtain those permits when they are truly deemed necessary. But again, I think that, right now we have a lot of choices, and one usually does not need to move where there is no parking right now.
Margot, I have an idea. I just ran it by Joe, and he didn't tell me to leave the building, so just want to get your reaction. What if we just said the parking minimums do not apply to affordable housing? And if you're building a unit that serves someone at 0 to 60 of median family income, which is where the greatest need is, we said that, and you enter into a regulatory agreement to keep, that doesn't run afoul of rent control, which we're preempted from doing.
Right now, till we overturn that ban.
I think within the current, we have to do with the hand we're dealt today. What if we just said on affordable units that parking minimum doesn't apply?
So let me just make sure I understand what you're saying. So right now, the minimum parking requirements don't kick in until after 30 units, right? So are you saying that, let's say there are 30 market rate units and 10 affordable units, there would still be no, those extra 10 wouldn't trigger the required parking spaces?
A, I don't have a fish plan on this. B, there's a lot of people who would disagree with that approach for a lot of good policy reasons. But since you led with housing affordability, I'm just asking you, one way we could clearly meet your concern is come up with a system that said for affordable units there is no parking minimum. And I don't know how we'd have to figure out how to structure it. I'm not pitching my amendment on this, but I'm trying to figure out whether there is a way to get at what you led with, which is anything that adds to the cost. I mean, the truth is, lots of things add to the cost of housing, even for affordable housing.
Especially for affordable housing, right? There's a lot of social costs built in.
Well, and for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
We want a low-income family to be able to send their kids to a school in Southwest and Outer East and Northeast and not just have one choice. So we sometimes build on higher cost dirt. But I'm trying to get philosophically what you would think about having a minimum but not applying it to affordable housing.
I mean, certainly in principle, I don't oppose that at all. I think that's a great idea. I worry, though, about the cost of market rate housing, because that is going to impact everybody who makes 61% and above median family income. And I think that anything that is adding to the cost of market rate housing is a concern.
It's an imperfect solution. But
it's imperfect,
something
sure.
to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Charlie So. Before I begin my testimony, I just want to point out that before we talked about there is 4,100 on-street permit spaces in Northwest. Actually, the Northwest parking study actually cites there are 6,184 on-street parking spaces. So I just want to correct that number out there for anyone who's paying attention. So I'm here today to ask City Council to reject new parking minimum requirements for Northwest Portland. Parking minimum requirements is a policy that subsidizes car storage at the expense of housing affordability by increasing housing costs and restricting the supply of new housing units. Parking makes housing more expensive by increasing construction costs. And according to a study in 2012 by the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, a parking space could cost between $20,000 to $55,000 to build, and that doesn't even include the land cost. The same study also shows that development with required on-site parking can increase monthly rent per unit between 6 to 60% compared to the same development without required parking, depending on the type of parking facility that's provided on-site. And parking requirements restrict new housing supply in Portland. City data actually shows that if parking requirements had existed in Northwest Portland in 2008, they would have illegalized 23% or 305 new housing units that have been built in Northwest Portland. Northwest Portland already has a lot of other parking management tools, such as residential parking permits, on-street parking meters, and now we have the option of shared parking. So I think without studying and evaluating just how effective these tools are in terms of managing parking resources, City Council should not rush to impose new parking requirements. The most effective way to manage parking demand is charging the right market price to reflect the true cost of parking and not imposing arbitrary requirements that force tenants to pay for parking through more expensive rent, regardless if they own a car. Portland already has too many cars. I urge City Council to not create more space for cars, but more space for people. Thank you.
Welcome. Good afternoon.
Hello, Mayor Hales, Commissioners. My name is Tony Jordan. I'm speaking on behalf of Portlanders for Parking Reform. I encourage you to pass the Planning and Sustainability Commission's recommendation to allow more shared parking, but to refrain from extending the minimum parking requirements into Northwest Plan area. Minimum parking requirements have been bad for the housing situation in Portland. How bad? No one really knows because we have not comprehensively studied the effect that they've had on the housing market. BPS data show that since 2013, we've seen an abnormally high rate of buildings built with exactly 30 apartments. Because of the 30-unit threshold for parking, the 31st unit brings a requirement for 6 parking stalls with it, which can cost, depending on where it's built, up to $300,000 in construction and even more in lost opportunity for that space of the parking spaces. And I think this is critical when we're talking about the effect on cost, because it's really the lost supply that is currently in our current market where prices are going to eat up the savings from the parking in a no parking building. It's the additional units in that building which are going to help more than the lack of parking construction currently. This is a policy that should be reformed or repealed and not expanded, especially during a housing crisis. Unlike neighborhoods in 2013, Northwest Portland has a toolbox full of parking management strategies at its disposal. Expanded permit zones, new meters, and after the recommended shared parking that we're asking for. And pretty soon we should have better permit programs available as well. So I think there's much less risk right now in waiting to see how these more flexible and equitable policies play out and then adjust them to work better rather than applying a policy that might not really help very much and certainly will hurt the will exacerbate the housing crisis. So I think that's really there's some evidence that when you talk about how we're going to get people out of their cars, when you look at transit-oriented developments that have access to cheap parking, people don't give up their cars. There was a study recently in New Jersey that showed that it was restricting the cost, increasing the cost of parking or restricting the access to parking that led people to get rid of those cars they don't use very much. Portland has a very wide ecosystem of car sharing opportunities, peer-to-peer and corporate. And I went car-free 7 years ago. I have a family with 2 small children. What made me do that was that I had the ability to move and use a zip car and use get-arounds and other things to go on weekend trips and use cars when I need them. Adding these parking requirements, I think, is a step in the wrong direction for our city, for our plans, and where we want to go. So I encourage you to not approve the amendment for minimum parking requirements. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Next 3, Ted Timmons, Rachel Shadone, Evan Heitman, and they'll be followed by Soren Impey, Chris Rahl, and Alan Kessler.
Good afternoon. Welcome.
Hi. I'll go ahead and start. I'm Ted Timmons. I live in Northwest. I was born here. I've lived a few other places, and I keep coming back. I live in the Northwest District. I love that I can just walk around. You have this in your notes. I'm a terrible speaker. I love that I can walk to coffee and groceries and more coffee. There's space in the Northwest where we don't have to destroy buildings, to destroy old houses, to put in more apartments, and by the way, not just apartments, but also condos and purchased housing. We don't have that in other places in the city. Northwest is different in that way. We can put in these large units and absorb more people than we can in some of the other areas of town. The complex at 19th and Overton, it has over 100 units. Those are 300 square foot units. So that's why there's so many units in there. These are micro houses. That's not someone who says, I want to live in a tiny amount of space and have a large car. Secondly, we have a lot of traffic in the Northwest already. I hear a lot of my neighbors complaining about it. There aren't many streets. If you want to get from Southwest or the West over, you have Cornell and you have the freeway. Cornell backs up miles every night. Do we really need, if we're adding 4,000 units, do we really need to add 3,000 more cars? Either they're not being used or we're putting them on the roads that are already full. So I'm concerned that it's really kind of an incumbent attitude of, hey, there's space in front of my house or in front of my building, and I feel like I own that space. And that's a public resource. It doesn't, it's not something that you own. It's not on your title. There's a reason for that. And for that reason, among many other reasons, it's really inappropriate to say, well, I was here first, so you don't get a permit. That, I think, is a really terrible way to go. Given that a permit's $5 a month, we might be underpricing that resource a little bit. So, that's what I've got. I'm concerned about that. I see no reason to enforce that.
But Ted, isn't any way of rationing permits unfair to somebody? I mean, if you raise the price, then that means that people without much money aren't going to be able to afford it, as opposed to rationing it based on who came there first.
What we've seen is that it's kind of a myth of, well, if we, for instance, in the central city, if we increase the price of parking, then, our lowest income people that come in can't afford to park here. There's a pretty strong correlation between car ownership and wealth. And, so that's kind of a myth to say, well, we need to make sure they're still affordable. Cars aren't affordable to begin with.
Hello, my name is Rachel Shadone, and I run Akashic Labs. It's a small data science and user experience research consultancy. And I'm here to encourage you to reject parking minimum requirements for Northwest. What this proposal comes down to for me is, do we want a city that's built for people, or do we want a city that's built for cars? I grew up in Oklahoma, spent the majority of my life in Oklahoma City, which is a city built for cars. It's larger in land area than Los Angeles and about 8 times less dense. Most of my memories of Oklahoma are of endless driving and miles of parking lots. It's not a good look for a city. In 2012, I worked with Intel on a project studying how people use cars. And one of the biggest takeaways was that cars are not in use 80 to 90% of the time. We have limited space here in Portland. That is just a reality of the city. And these parking requirements required using these valuable space resources that could be used to house people, to accommodate privately held resources that aren't even in use most of the time. Cars are a public health nightmare, not just from an accident, injury, and death perspective, but also from a perspective of pollution and carbon footprint. We should not be putting in place regulations that encourage or make easier the ownership of cars. Car ownership disincentivizes investment in public infrastructure, in bike lanes, in public transit. All of these things that we are having to build a city together. And because of the very low unit requirement, the 30, that takes limited space and encourages small developments. And this idea that small developments are better is sort of, it's lovely, but housing is expensive, and we need to make the most efficient use of the space that we have unless we want to become like San Francisco, which is something that I also don't want for Portland. So in effect, Portland is growing, we've got limited time and limited space, and we're going to keep coming up against these choices. Do we want a city for people or a city for cars? And I want to live in a city for people.
Thank you very much. Afternoon.
Hi, my name is Evan Heitman. I'm here to testify on the parking minimums. I hope that you'll reject the proposal. I've already submitted written testimony, so I'll keep this one brief. Commissioner Novick and others have emphasize that sort of frame this as a short-term issue, that we have a problem in Northwest with parking and we need to solve it. But this proposed solution of parking minimums is not a temporary solution. This is a permanent solution. This is a change to the regulation that would have effects for several decades. And several decades from now, I don't know about you, but I want to live in a Portland that has fewer cars, not more. And so I think that if you, like me, want to see fewer cars and not more cars in Portland, then you'll support smarter parking management strategies and reject parking minimums.
Thank you. Thank you all.
The next three, please. Soren Impey, Chris Rawl, Alan Kessler. They'll be followed by Doug Klotz, Philip Sellinger, and Jonathan Avery.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome. Go ahead.
Alan Kessler, I'm here on behalf of Bike Walk Vote. I want to let everyone know that Bike Walk Vote is watching this vote very carefully. It is absolutely against anything that would increase reliance and ease of use of automobiles in the city core. We are particularly concerned, maybe this point hasn't been mentioned yet, that more cars degrade transit. If you have more cars on the streetcar moves slower, it's easier to walk rather than ride it. Cars get backed up into the box, they block the max, they make the buses slower. The more cars that you try to fit into the geometry of a district, the slower transit gets. And it's a vicious circle because when transit gets slower, people think, oh, I need to use a car to get around because I can't rely on transit anymore. There's no doubt in my mind, being a person who comes downtown every day, that there are already too many cars in the area. Every day there's a huge backup. I have to weave in the gutter with my bicycle to get to the bridges because people are backed up, sitting, idling, sitting off smog, to be in this space with their cars. I think that from comments that I've seen from some of your offices, some of you know that this is bad policy, that parking minimums are a last solution in a big stack of good solutions. You also know that we're working on good solutions. You have already passed a great toolkit that Northwest has to try to improve the situation. And it would be a terrible irony if the council today approved parking minimums, the tools that are already in place worked, and then people credit the parking minimums with having improved the situation. Then we would be stuck in these dark ages for a lot longer. I saw a couple of your offices say something like, well, we can pass this now, but roll it back across the city later. And I think that's the wrong move. That's not how you will shift the momentum if you give in to this request for bad policy to placate some neighbors. One other point I want to touch on that's not really in the Bike Walk Vote purview is this affordable housing issue. I think that there's a lot of focus placed on MFI, less than 60%, but there are really good reasons to want market rate housing to be affordable for the middle class. And when you think about affordable housing, there are lots of different definitions, but I think you should absolutely be considering the people who will live in those 350 square foot apartments in the 120 unit building. I think those people should be given consideration too, because we don't want just those people who are eligible and then the very wealthy to live in it. We want a spectrum of people. Finally, that building, that 120 unit building, is exactly what this proposal will destroy. You need the geometry of the situation is you need that space for small houses to make a project that big work. And if you require every single building to have parking spots once they get over a max, those buildings just won't work. And there was a great article in Bike Portland that actually talked to the developer and explained exactly how that will make it so that we won't have these big buildings full of small units that might actually become affordable to the middle class.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Chris Rawl. I live at 2332 Southeast 54th Avenue. And you may wonder, why does someone from Southeast care about what's going on in Northwest? Well, a couple things. One is that our whole city's in a housing crisis. I think this proposal for minimum parking, off-street parking requirements could have an impact on housing, particularly market rate. So we're very concerned about that. I have friends and colleagues who are moving out of town, moving to places like Troutdale. You know, a colleague whose wife doesn't drive, and they're out there now because they don't afford to live in Portland anymore. Where are my kids going to live when they're old enough to go out and get their apartment if we don't have enough housing supply in 10 years from now when they're flying away from my coop? Number two is I agree that the challenge to park in Northwest is, you know, it's a challenge there. My daughter is part of the Pacific Youth Choir. We got to get to Northwest sometimes, and it can be a disaster zone. But the thing about these off-street parking minimums, it's a little bit like, you know, having a cut on your hand and you apply a tourniquet. I actually like that tourniquet analogy. Rather than actually addressing the situation, you know, do some compression and elevation, solve the problem with it on your hand. We're, you know, putting the tourniquet on the arm. You know, the problem is on street. So address it with on-street policies that address the street and how you manage parking on the street. As long as parking on the street is cheaper than parking off street, people are going to park on the street. You know, with the existing imbalance, if you think about adding these off-street spots and trying to kind of regulate that into new development, it's going to barely make a dent in the huge imbalance you already have in terms of the permit, that imbalance of how many permits have been sold and how many parking spaces there are. So I fail to see how it's going to actually solve the problem. So what I'd like to see is not adding parking minimums in Northwest. And then I really agree with this idea of parity. I think we need to revisit the rest of the city and look at pulling back minimums from the rest of the city. And number three, just keep moving forward. We've got a lot of tools that the city is developing in terms of managing on-street parking. I think we're on the right track. We just need to continue to actually apply those market-based principles. We need to think about equity and figure out how to have ways for low-income folks to have a low-income program for permits or whatever it is, other ways to try to make sure we're addressing those issues. And we can do this. So thank you.
Hi, Soren Impey, and I have rented in Portland for almost 17 years. So I am very much opposed to mandating parking minimums. As you've heard, Portland is suffering from a rental crisis with vacancy rates that have been among the lowest in the nation for a very extended period. And thousands of Portland residents have been displaced due to rent increases and redevelopment of units. And low-income people are affected, but in my neighborhood, I'm seeing my middle-income neighbors displaced or moving because of this housing crisis. So I wanted to just make that point because this policy will affect, in the short term, middle-income people more, but they are also being displaced and affected by this housing crisis. And I wanted to focus too on the types of units or buildings that are being built. And it's my understanding that most luxury housing tends to exceed parking minimums. So this policy is really targeting low and middle income buildings. So it represents, in essence, an indirect tax on the people who are most affected by the housing crisis. And in terms of equity, in terms of rationing, as has been discussed, I do want to also reiterate that if you look at census data in Portland, it is low-income people that tend to walk or use transit the most as their transportation mode. So I really want to strongly urge you to reject what I view as an unfair and unequal indirect tax on lower and middle income people. So, and apart from housing equity, there's this issue of Portland's climate action plan and Portland's active transportation plans. This would be a big step backwards by sort of reinforcing the idea that we need to mandate parking. We are essentially making a statement, that Portland will not or is unwilling to meet its goals, of less than 50% car mode share, automobile mode share, 25% bike mode share. And I'll just want to finish because there's discussion about the people who own cars and are not getting rid of them. I happen to be one of them. I have an electric vehicle. I think I have not driven it as a single occupant for years. Okay? And why do I have this car? Because parking is so inexpensive and so underpriced in this city. If I had to pay $10 or $20 a month for parking, I'd get rid of the car instantly. So I urge you to not support parking minimums.
Thank you all.
Next three, please. Doug Klotz, Philip Sellinger, Jonathan Avery. They'll be followed by Corey Poole, Reza Farhouli, and Joselle Johnson.
Hi, my name is Doug Klotz. I live in Southeast, and I am here to give you examples of how the parking minimums have played out in Southeast. And I was one of those urging you not to put the minimums in place back in 2013. But since they're in place, what we've seen is up to a 40% loss in units in buildings. Just giving two examples right across the street from each other. At 30th and Hawthorne, 3013 Southeast Hawthorne, there's a 100 by 100 foot lot, and they built a 50 unit building there before the minimums were required. And currently there's a building under construction right across the street at 1515 Southeast 31st. It's right on Hawthorne, 100 by 100 foot lot. It's going to have 30 units. So the comparison right there is we were getting 50 before the requirement, now we're getting 30. It's not exactly all that, but that's kind of the general trend. You get a lot of 30 unit buildings as you've seen testimony, as you've probably had some charts mailed to you also. That shows the 14 buildings that are built right at 30 in the last couple of years. And what do you get instead of 50 units, you get 30 units, and well, we can't put in more units, but we can make the ones we have bigger so that we get more expensive units, but we don't get more units. We have extra space, we can put in a restaurant, so we have more restaurant space, but we don't have 20 units of housing, which would arguably be more useful, in inner Southeast and certainly in Northwest to have the housing rather than more commercial space, which we sometimes seem to have too much of already. And especially these are in Southeast, these are spots right where we're on transit, where we want to put people, and in Northwest, we have the most transit-rich environment in the city. This is where it makes the most sense to have the most people living. We don't want to be artificially reducing the number of people who could live there. Alan mentioned the 120 unit buildings, and that's as you mentioned, that's the sort of thing that if there are no limits on how many units you can build, but then you can build smaller ones if there's a market for them and you want to build those. With the 30 unit minimum, with the parking requirements, you're not going to get that. So I would say that we don't want to have the parking minimums added at this point. Work on the management of the on-street and price it so that people will make the choice not to have a car. We'll look at ways to accommodate low income, those with disabilities, and other ways to make the equity picture of part of it work. But we need to have the market sending signals to folks that, well, maybe I don't need to have a car here.
Thank you, Doug. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of the council. My name is Phil Sellinger. I'm a member of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee and a resident of Northwest Thurman Street. I believe in a balanced set of transportation management strategies for the increasingly dense and active Northwest neighborhood. The modest citywide parking minimums framework should be one of those strategies, but I also support more aggressive promotion of active transportation modes and demand management programs. I would have preferred to fully exhaust the TDM strategies before implementing parking minimums, but new development is quickly upon us and integrated parking cannot be provided retroactively. Providing some baseline of off-street parking would seem prudent. The citywide parking minimums baseline is more modest than many in the NWDA and fellow SAC members would have liked, but appropriate, I believe, in a neighborhood with decent transportation options. I do acknowledge that some of the exceptions in the framework are flawed and that the provision of affordable housing should be one of those exceptions. It is encouraging that the Bike Town program will have a strong presence in Northwest. A proposed crosstown bus route using the Fremont Bridge should also be popular. Pedestrian and bike infrastructure improvements at 18th, 19th, and West Burnside, as well as I-405 overcrossings at Northwest Cooch and Flanders, and new street connections related to the Conway Master Plan will all help. I concede that the lack of off-street parking is affecting the quality of life for anyone with a car and creating more traffic as folks hunt for that elusive parking space. I hope someday we can reduce car ownership with car sharing and other services and programs. I think the conservative citywide minimums framework would continue to nudge my neighbors in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Avery. I'm the president of Legacy Good Samaritan Medical Center, and I may be the outlier in the room because I'm here just to talk about shared parking. Good Samaritan is strongly in support of the proposed code change, which would make it possible for Good Sam to share our parking assets with residents, visitors, and businesses in Northwest Portland. For a little bit of background, Good Sam has about 2,000 employees and another 600 physicians and their staff work on our campus right now in our medical office buildings. And we care for about 60,000 patients annually. To provide parking for all of these folks, we operate around 2,000 stalls in our accessory lots today. We have a complex parking situation in that during peak weekday hours, we have shortages of parking today on occasions. That's become a bigger and bigger problem over time as both Northwest Portland and Legacy have grown. It's our number one goal to ensure that our patients and visitors have access to parking, and we have made a number of changes to achieve this goal, including greatly increasing our employees' incentives to use public transportation. Conversely, on non-peak hours, mostly evenings and weekends for us, we have excess parking capacity with hundreds of stalls open in multiple lots. Our goal is to make our underutilized parking assets available to those who need it in Portland. We see it as a big win both for Northwest Portland and for Legacy. First of all, it would reduce all of the traffic congestion we see right now that's caused by the endless searching around our neighborhoods for scarce spaces. It would provide more spaces to residents, shoppers, and businesses. And finally, for Legacy, it would help us to defray our cost of running our parking systems, which are very expensive to operate annually. Unfortunately, there's no ability for us to do this under the current code because short-term pay-to-park options are not allowed for accessory lots. So we're strong supporters of the proposed code amendments and the administrative rules that will allow us to operate our accessory lots as commercial parking once our specific plans are approved by the SAC. This will make available hundreds of parking stalls after hours and weekends to shoppers and other visitors in Northwest Portland. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That's a big resource. Thank you.
Next three, please. Corey Poole, Reza on Northwest 12th, and Joselle Johnson. And they will be followed by Stephen Judkins, Ron Walters, and Sarah Anaran.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Corey Poole. I live in Southeast Portland, and I fondly remember looking for parking in Northwest, 20-some years ago, and being very frustrated at that time finding parking in Northwest. So I appreciate we've had this problem for a while. I am speaking out against the parking minimums, primarily from a safety standpoint. You know, I think of the work that this council and we've done with Vision Zero. I think of my friend Alistair, who about a year ago today lost his leg because of a careless driver. And we need to face that every additional car coming into the city where the streets are already at capacity, where there's already outrageous congestion, becomes an increasing risk to pedestrians, to bicyclists, to skateboarders, to kids on scooters, to adults on scooters. You know, I just can't see how in this time that we could be encouraging, even mandating that people bring more cars. Please bring more cars to Portland is what we're saying with this. I also think back a lot to the PBOT transportation hierarchy, you know, and on that hierarchy, for those who don't know, pedestrians, I believe, are at the top, followed by, I don't know, bicycles, transit, taxi cabs. Way at the bottom is single occupancy vehicles. So it kind of bewilders me that the single occupancy vehicle keeps coming to the top on all these discussions as the most important thing that needs to be addressed immediately and needs to be accommodated. You know, parking is not a human right. You know, there's nowhere it says that you are obligated to a store your vehicle in the public right away. I don't know where that exists. So I guess I would just say that I would hope that maybe after we've addressed all the safety for pedestrians, maybe after the last sidewalk is built, maybe after Google self-driving cars are here and the street cars running all over town, maybe then we could come back and revisit parking minimums. But until then, I just don't see why we're addressing it.
Thanks very much. Guys, welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Arhudi. I'm with the Pearl District Neighborhood Association, but these words are my own. I want to start by saying I'm 100% against the parking minimums aspect of this proposal, chiefly for the reasons of housing affordability and safety, two things that our city desperately needs. But I think this issue of parking scarcity, it can be described more as a three-legged stool. You have the parking minimums for off-street parking. You have market-based permit pricing parking for on-street parking, and you also have the presence of whether you have quality alternatives to driving. All three of these issues need to be addressed. When we talk about permit pricing, you've heard the cost of a permit per year is $60. It's $150 per month on average. Where is the incentive for people to park in the garage if parking is available so cheaply and so abundantly in the terms of the number of permits that are being subscribed to on street? And then in terms of the quality alternatives, you might remember last fall when the PPOC came to discuss the neighborhood greenway assessment report, looking at the conditions of neighborhood greenways throughout the city, and Northwest Portland scored pretty low, chiefly because many of the greenways in Northwest have too many automobile volumes, too high automobile volumes. And Mr. Mayor, I'm glad you brought up the point about transit nirvana. Contrary to popular opinion, much of Northwest Portland is not what you would consider a transit mecca, especially the further north you go in the district, such as where the Tess O'Brien apartments are located. They've gotten a lot of attention. So I don't think any TriMet or Portland streetcar staff are in this room, but they should be because they're a big part of the solution here. Northwest Portland is in desperate need of more service coverage, more service frequency, and a greater span of service. The recently adopted service enhancement plan by TriMet last week actually would provide new service in the fast-growing section of Conway and North Pearl, and would add more service along existing lines such as Line 16, Line 20, and Line 77. So while I steadfastly oppose any sort of mandatory parking minimum, until these biking and transit enhancements are implemented, and until permit pricing is made more fair and equitable at a level on or near the price of off-street parking, we will continue to see negative externalities resulting from people moving to these developments with their cars and thinking they could just park on the street for very little money. This situation must change. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Hi, my name's Joselle Johnson, and I'm actually a 25-year-old homeowner of a small multifamily housing in Northwest Portland. I've seen in the last 25 years where we've gone from actually having 1.5 cars per housing to a gasp, I'm down to 1.25. I still have over a 1-to-1 car ratio into my units. 75% of my units do not work in Portland. They are not available for transit. I'm Nike, I'm Intel, I'm actually supporting Beaverton and pharmaceutical owners. For me, I actually had to purchase off-street parking to become affordable, well, not affordable, to become competitive with the new housing going in so that I could attract tenants. For me, I welcome actually the shared housing, thank you, but I actually support the minimum requirement for the construction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Next three, please. Stephen Judkins, Ron Walters, Sarah Iannone, and they will be followed by Thomas Ranieri, Frank Stock, and Patrick Rafferty.
Good afternoon. Welcome. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Stephen Judkins. I grew up in Portland, and recently I was lucky enough to purchase a house. I'm concerned about the fact that, and generally, most people testifying here are people who are privileged homeowners like myself. I understand that it's very difficult for someone that's relied on on-street parking in Northwest Portland to find it now, that it's becoming difficult, and new developments will make it even harder for them. I think it's very important that we keep in perspective the challenges people who are renters in this time of pretty dire housing affordability crisis. I bought my house 4 years ago. This last year, the appreciation on it exceeded my salary. So if I wasn't lucky enough, this dream of being able to stay in Portland would be rapidly receding from my sights. Like I said, I understand it's hard, like it's pretty big inconvenience, but there are tools we can use to make it easier. And if the trade-off we're talking about is to make it easy for people to find parking with increasing the minimums, or to constrict supply further and make it more difficult for people to find housing, I think really the right thing to do for the council is to do anything to help people afford to live in Portland. That said, I really like Commissioner Novik's idea of some novel strategies to restrict the number of permits available for on-street parking. And we already have the neighborhood parking permit program that gives the neighborhood some tools to control this better. But like I said, this binary option here, if is going to be less affordability or less easy parking. And I think looking at it from perspective of human welfare, affordability and ability to have a home should come out on top instead of easy parking for people that are generally wealthy and securely housed. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Ron Walters. I live at 2057 Northwest Overton Street. That was a fantastic introduction, by the way, and we didn't plan this. I was NWDA president when the Northwest Parking Plan was negotiated. I currently serve on the NWDA board and the Northwest Parking Stakeholder Advisory Committee. However, my testimony today is personal. I'm a supporter of affordable housing and sensible parking policy. I want both. I believe both goals are achievable and compatible with a simple policy change. It's essentially the one that's been raised here as an alternative a couple times already today. I believe it's oversimplified, if not inaccurate, to suggest that no parking equals lower rent. In fact, I think the absence of parking minimums simply opens the door to increased developer profits and does not assure more affordable housing in our tight housing market. We need to make sure that the savings accrued by not building off-street parking are passed along to renters and the public, simply not captured by developers who choose not to provide parking. I believe there's a fairly straightforward solution. Permits should not be readily available to residents of new market rate developments that don't offer off-street parking. It's a win-win-win. Developers who argue that their renters don't have cars are not required to provide parking. Renters who don't have cars aren't required to pay for it, and the public isn't burdened with the cost of increased demand for limited on-street parking. The market will pair renters who don't own cars with more affordable developments that don't offer parking. And I think as been raised, exceptions and incentives could be made for affordable housing units. So I encourage the City Council to evaluate and implement some type of plan like this, which will assure more affordable housing and not worsen the already difficult parking situation in Northwest Portland. In the meantime, regarding this timing issue, I do support parking minimums as a tourniquet. It's an imperfect but important tool that will help us balance parking supply and demand in the short term while we find a more comprehensive set of policies and programs that can be deployed in the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Commissioners. Thank you very much for your time today. My name is Sarah Iannarone. Many of you know me because I was running for mayor recently, but what I do every day for a living is try to finish my PhD in Portland State on sustainable urban development and share our policies and best practices and what we're working on here with visitors from around the world, many of whom, when we started our program 8 years ago, came here to ride the streetcar from the Pearl District to the Northwest District to see what would it look like if they made investments in transit in their own area. How could they grow places affordably, equitably, sustainably? We're seen as a model around the world. And frankly, the mandatory parking minimums, there's nothing innovative or model about that behavior. It's a blunt instrument, and it's not particularly the pathway, as you've heard from the experts here, that we should be taking. There are many, many other things that we should be requiring and trying out first before construction, especially when we're in the midst of an affordable housing crisis. I know that you all realize the urgency and the importance of dealing with that housing crisis. I thank you very much for your recent efforts in that area with the excise tax, referring the affordable housing bond to voters this November, and all the other actions you've taken in the last 18 months. But we need to think carefully about how can we see these times of crisis as opportunities for us to be in that position as a leader. What do we think about when we think about the transportation demand management tools that we were able to develop when we worked on the mixed-use zones and town centers plan that Doug Klotz was with me on, that Grant Moorhead is here today? There are things coming right down the pike that we're going to be able to try very, very soon. So I would ask you, please hold off on instituting something as permanent as parking minimums with new construction there in Northwest Portland, and consider using some more innovative, equitable, climate-based transportation, transit, bicycle, pedestrian-oriented tools before we think about looking at parking minimums in that district. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Next three, please. Thomas Ranieri, Frank Stoll, Patrick Rafferty. They'll be followed by Ian McKenzie, Wendy Chung, and Tony Schwartz.
Good afternoon. Welcome.
My name is Tom Ranieri, and I am a member of the SAC and have been involved in the parking issues in Northwest Portland for about 26 years now. I'm going to have to make my comments quick because I'm about to get a parking ticket. However, I was primarily coming down here today to support the passage, or at least put my support for the parking minimums. And I was hoping to hear from developers who could speak to the issue of the affordability impact that this the parking minimums would put on the development of new spaces. And I was wondering if, prior to voting on this, there can be more testimony from people that are actually involved in building that could speak to whether or not these increases are as big as some people are claiming. The other thing I would say is that the idea of kicking this down the road after we've tried some other things, I don't see how we have that much time left. I mean, I've been, as Commissioner Fritz mentioned, it was Sam Adams' last hurrah with the parking, but I've witnessed now Vera Katz and Tom Potter and Sam Adams and now Charlie Hales, and I'm wondering if after all this time, it'll be 30 years, if it's Ted Wheeler's turn. So, I'm hoping that we could move on this, because we've been promised a lot over the years in Northwest Portland, and so far we haven't received that much in terms of trying to tamp out this extremely difficult problem for everybody that lives and works and recreates in Northwest Portland. Thanks.
Thank you.
What you're really saying is that you've tried everything else, and that the committee has looked at everything else, and that you unanimously came to a recommendation of parking minimums.
What I'm saying is that I think it's a reasonable approach to have parking minimums put in there, especially for developers who claim that they're building for people who are not going to be, having any car ownership. I mean, that's a possibility right there of just saying, if they're making that claim that they don't have car ownership, then maybe they don't get the permits. I mean, we've looked at a lot of different things. I mean, we have a lot of different stuff to look at beyond the parking minimums. But I think that we're looking at this in a balanced sort of way. There's a lot of experience, a lot of institutional experience there, and what I think we really need to do in terms of, I mean, if the issue really is one of affordability, if that's what was driving the vote 5-2, I think it'd be really important to get some better data about that, or at least public data about how much it actually costs. Most of the the housing stock in Northwest Portland is old. So we're really talking about the new portion of it. And so, let's look at whether or not, my personal belief is that the market is just whipping everything up here, and we're sort of embroidering around the edges with the policy. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but the wind that this economy and the market is kicking up is enormous. It's creating its own weather.
Welcome. I'm Frank Stockholm. Thank you, Mayor and City Council. Fortunately, I'm speaking for one of the developers that is doing this. Has a couple current projects in the Northwest Plan District, and it does matter. So it's simple math. I think most people understand. We're marketing to the influx of tenants that are coming here that there's not going to be parking. They realize they're coming here. They look at the units. They realize there's no magic to make parking that's not there. They're asking for secured bike storage. It's a whole different influx of tenants. If this is passed, what you're going to do is continue to see the 30 units or less. Math is math. So if we are required to put the parking for above the 30 units, then that's just what's going to happen. So we're in agreement of the shared parking, just with Legacy saying that that would be great for us to offer to our tenants for the night times and weekends. The cost of the parking stalls, they're around $50,000. And if you just do the simple math, that's decades to recover that cost. I got a little confused about the PowerPoint that was up on the screen earlier that suggested the range was from 1,560 to 1,175 for the studio units. And then some of them had parking and some of them didn't. We actually own one of the properties that was in there. That's the range. So you see the 1,560, you see the 1,175, you see the difference in the cost because the parking wasn't provided. Some of the people can't actually afford the 1,560 for a studio. So we're, many of our places are market rate, but recently in the Northwest Plan District, we're approved for the affordable housing component. So that's what we're going to continue to do. I can't say that's the driving factor for parking, because then what does that do, as the previous gentleman said about the market rate units? Those are going to go up. So if you don't get, the costs will have to be recovered in some way. We wrote a letter to City Council, and I'm just going to briefly go through this just to state. The parking requirements for the Northwest District would have a serious negative impact on the future supply of the affordable housing if passed, and housing as a whole. The ability to create new affordable urban rental housings with escalating land costs, the increased permit costs, increased labor wages, increased material costs, and we just passed increased taxes for our construction. It's already a serious constraint, and yet we're asking for us to reduce the rent costs. The costs are the cost. The majority of renters in the urban do not have the automobiles, at least the ones that are applying to us. The general public demand is a non-project related tenancy and will not support new parking either. Therefore, it becomes a secondary burden to the development and the ownership. One, cost. Number two, debt service. With that being said, I think you got my message. I don't need to continue on. Thank you very much. We vote to reject it.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So you heard the idea discussed of, rather than having minimum parking requirements, limiting the number of permits that new buildings get, so not everybody in the new building would necessarily get a permit to park on the street. If you could only promise permits to park in the permit area to half of the prospective tenants, do you think that you would still have demand for your units, and people would say, okay, I know I don't have a parking space on site, I might not even be able to park on the street, but I still want that unit? Or would there be no market for that?
Absolutely. I think you're on the right path. I don't know what that number is, what the percentage is, but I was paying attention when you mentioned that earlier. If you saw the stats that were posted, the 120 had, what was it, 90 or 60? So the percentage is already working out. So we would be in agreement with that. That's good to know. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Rafferty, just a concerned citizen.
I urge you not to pass this. There have been a handful of people who have been in favor of it and 4 or 5 handfuls of people today who have not been. I think everything has already been said. The one thing that I will say is that cars are not a fact of life. People have said that earlier today, and as long as we keep parking relatively inexpensive, cars will remain a way of life. They don't have to be. That's all.
Thank you all.
The next 3, Ian McKenzie, Wendy Chung, Tony Schwartz, and then our last 2 will be Ben Schoenberg and Bill Welch.
Good afternoon, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Go ahead, please.
My name is Ian McKenzie. I'm here to support the ordinance as introduced and oppose any amendments that would add parking minimums to new development. I'm a member of the Northwest District Association Transportation Committee, but I'm only speaking on my own behalf. I love Northwest. It's a true 20-minute neighbourhood that achieves so many of the things that we set out to do in Portland. It's really walkable, and most of the daily necessities of life can be found in the neighbourhood or in a short walk to the Pearl or downtown. It's why I choose to live there without a car. A lot of other people like the neighbourhood too, which is probably why it's one of the fastest growing parts of the city. It's also an income diverse area. Some of the census tracts in the heart of the Alphabet District have median incomes of just $28,000 or $35,000, which is far below the citywide average. In the neighbourhood as a whole, 76.3% of the housing units are occupied by renters, myself included. I live in a 1927 apartment building, which is typical of the market rate but relatively affordable housing that can be found throughout the neighbourhood. With 75 units and no parking, my building would be illegal today to build in most parts of the city, but luckily would still be allowed in Northwest absent any changes. The demand to live in Northwest is so strong that any parking minimums probably wouldn't result in less construction overall. Developers would find ways to make the huge cost of underground or mechanical parking work for their pro formas. What would probably change is what is built. Buildings like the 120 unit zero parking building, the Tess O'Brien Apartments, which was approved by the City Council at appeal last year, would no longer be possible. It wouldn't be physically possible to fit the 40 parking stalls required on the awkwardly shaped site. In order to reduce the number of parking spaces required, the developer or another developer would probably have chosen to build fewer but larger units and to market them as luxury apartments. I've heard Commissioner Fish lament many times, including today, that almost all the new construction in Portland is aimed at the luxury market. Any changes to city code that start adding massive new costs for parking would only exacerbate that trend. The wonderful mix of housing types Northwest has now would be less possible in the future. So I'd urge you not to consider any requests to add new parking minimums. The City Council added parking minimums in much of the rest of the city in 2013. We're now 3 years into that experiment, but according to BPS Director Anderson, when she was speaking to the Planning and Sustainability Commission in March, no analysis has been done by the city to date on what effect that's had in affordability. Since last year, we've been in a declared housing crisis, and I don't think now is the right time to further experiment with adding parking minimums back into city code. I love my neighbourhood, and I love the way it's growing, so please don't change that. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Wendy.
Good afternoon. I'm Wendy Chung. Mayor Hales, commissioners, thank you for allowing this testimony. I'm so glad that Ian went right before me because he helps to illustrate some of the points that I'd like to make today really strongly, because he lives in a 1927 building with relatively affordable rents, which, by the way, could never add parking if it wanted to. So unlike other neighborhoods across the city which have the minimum parking requirements, Northwest is unique in that we have a large historic district, as you know, not just with historic single-family homes like Irvington or Laurelhurst or Eastmoreland or places like that, but we have multi-family, reasonably priced apartments that they can't add parking whether they want to or not because they're historic, right? And so when we talk about equity, and I think Commissioner Fish talked about this, one of the things I haven't heard is a lot of discussion about equity in terms of, I've heard general statements, we need more housing. Of course we need more housing, we're in a housing crisis. We need less cars. Of course we need less cars because we got carbon problems, right? Nobody is disputing any of that. I do think that we're not in parking nirvana in Northwest. Mayor Hales, respectfully speaking, I grew up on the east.
Not parking nirvana.
Okay, transit nirvana.
I know you're not parking nirvana.
Okay. Well, I grew up on the East Coast, and I spent several years in New York City, where families live there with kids, and they got on the transit and they got off the transit. That's just not possible in Northwest. So people with children, people with elderly relatives whom they're taking care of, or disabled people, all three of those groups are represented on my street alone. Okay, they need cars. And while I might say, well, from an equity standpoint, unless you want to push all of those people out and have single professionals who are able to live in 300 square foot units that are exorbitant, I know the imagination, are affordable, and with no kitchen, so they can eat out because they can afford to eat out, right? They can afford to rent a car on the weekend and go to Mount Hood. This is an equity issue, and one of the things I think people are not understanding is that Northwest is not a rich neighborhood. If you look at the documents I gave you, you'll see this spring survey of medium one-bedroom rents. You'll see Northwest District has an average rent of $1,360. These are for one-bedroom units. The highlighted section of the Pearl, Old Town, Chinatown, and downtown Portland, which is actually part of the central city. As you know, Northwest is not part of the central city. But for whatever reason, we are the only neighborhood outside the central city that wasn't included in the parking minimums. All we're asking for is not special attention. We're just asking not to be discriminated against because we happen to have fallen out of the ordinances that were passed for everybody else. Regarding affordability, a building like the one that Ian lives in, just to give you an idea, currently, at this very moment, has a one-bedroom for rent, and there's a link to it in your letter, for $995. Compare that to $995 for a 250 square foot micro unit on Thurman. I mean, which is actually more affordable. Also, much has been made about Tess O'Brien and the 120 units that were built, and whether or not they would have been built had they had requirements for parking. I just want to point out that the Bike.org article that cites that project clarifies that those units are 300 square feet. They're $1,200 to $1,400 a month. Frankly, if something like that weren't built in our neighborhood, I'd be thrilled. I'd be happy if Commissioner Novick or Saltzman were able to build a whole bunch of affordable housing units with or without parking. And I agree with Commissioner Fish that those units should be exempted from the minimum parking requirements. But I think that what it does is not passing it in our neighborhood unfairly discriminates against people who live in historic buildings, whether they're single-family homes or, more importantly, those apartments, and then separately, people with families, disabled relatives, and others.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Schwartz. I live at 17th and Irving in Northwest. I was listening to the folks who are advocating for the status quo, and I was thinking we all share the same goals, which are less cars, less pollution, more truly affordable housing, and more income diversity in the neighborhood. I am a proponent of a code revision to include the parking minimums in the Northwest District for all kinds of different reasons, but primarily so we are taken into the city. And so the city can revisit these macro issues on a citywide level. It seems to me that it's fanciful to believe that not keeping or not putting in more parking minimums in our district would all of a sudden result in less cars is simply untrue. I haven't heard any experts really talk about that in depth. I've heard about developers, but I can tell you from my own personal experience on 17th and Irving, we had a developer from Eco House come and redevelop, it's called Hoyt. It's an old Powell's bookstore warehouse that was empty, and we were thankful that it was developed into studio apartments. Those studio apartments are now running for $1,100 to $1,500 a month. That is not truly affordable. We all know that. We know who they're marketing to. In discussions with that developer in a neighborhood meeting, that developer told us he's marketing to those folks with bicycles, to those folks who walk. Great. But I can tell you, walking my dog, walking to and from work to my office downtown, walking to and from the theater, I see people getting in and out of their cars, to and from that Hoyt building every day. I don't think this district should be used as a guinea pig for what I believe are probably unproven, fanciful public policy notions. We all want less cars. We all want to live in a city that is about people and not for doors and 4 wheels. Take us into the rest of the city. Think about the macros.
By weekend, but we don't have that. If the federal government took climate seriously and was building the New York City subway system everywhere, then that would be a different thing. So I understand the parity argument the Northwest is making. And particularly, I mean, it is absolutely true that parking is more constrained in Northwest than it is in Division, and we've adopted the parking minimums 2013 largely in response to a hue and cry in Division. But parking minimums are extremely problematic. I mean, I don't care what current prices are in Northwest for units with or without parking, which might be based on some short-term weirdness. If you increase the cost of something, you increase the cost of something. There is no way that requiring parking to be built with new buildings does not drive up the cost. And if we're building more parking, one of the things we're doing is enabling and encouraging more driving. And until we have all electric cars and all renewable electricity, enabling more driving is destroying the planet. So those are 2 really strong arguments against parking minimums that are hard to get around.
Steve, when would this next phase come back to council?
Well, I think that it is something that, the toolkit is something that I think is going to require a lot of public discussion because, for one thing, as to how you allocate permits in a constrained environment, I think that no solution is going to seem fair to people. So I think it's going to take a lot of thought and discussion before we come to the least unfair solution on that. But I'm hoping to, I want to get that process going, a broader public outreach process going really quickly, and plan to bring something in the next few months. It may be, though, that before that, we might want to pilot a new approach in Northwest in response to the cry we're hearing from that district now. And one of my guiding principles in life is Chris Smith is smarter than I am. He demonstrated that in the year 2000. We were working against...
He's really smart.
When we were working against a...
Chris, you went to Harvard when you were 11? Dear God, man.
When we were working against a Bill Sizemore tax cut for the rich, and he identified a key fact that I had missed, and it was my job to catch it. So when Chris threw out the other day, well, what about just carving new big buildings out of the parking permit area? And then I called Rick Michelson, and he said, hey, that sounds great. I was like, all right, maybe we've got an idea here. Now, that may very well not be illegal, but it may be that some version of that where you allocate only some permits to the new buildings might be legal. I want to talk to the lawyers about that. I want to talk to more developers about that. I thought it was interesting. One developer we had here today said that he thought that there'd still be a market for such buildings. So what I want to do is, bring the full package to council as quickly as I can, but I think it's possible that we might come up with a daring, innovative thing to just try in Northwest in the near future. So I plan to talk to all of you about those ideas and talk to some developers and talk to the lawyers over the next couple of weeks.
Okay. So any other thoughts? And then do you want us to?
So what I'm hearing is that the commissioner in charge of transportation would like to have more time to look at both the citywide issues and the issues in Northwest. I am struck that the community, the neighborhood association and the advisory committee came with a unanimous recommendation to do the minimums, which I don't remember that much unanimity in our past discussions. And these are the folks that we've charged to look at what would work in Northwest and what wouldn't, and this is what they came to us. I would withdraw the motion, the amendment that I made, with the promise that it is going to be looked at and brought back in a speedy manner, and including the Northwest District folks as experts.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo Commissioner Fritz's call for urgency. I do feel bad that, there is the word's been overused today, but there is an equity perception here that Northwest is somehow not being treated fairly vis-a-vis Southeast Division Street in that area. And I believe there's merit to that. But I also feel that I've learned today that there's a lot of tools at the disposal of Northwest that maybe haven't been fully explored. It sounds like they will be, and I think that's, before I'm more comfortable deciding one way or the other on parking minimums, I'd like to see that, and including the shared parking, which I think we're about to pass. I think there's great creative potential there too, for some great minds to get together and figure out ways that we can use shared parking to satisfy the needs of those residents who are going to have cars and want to park overnight primarily. So I don't want to see this disappear into the ether. I think there's a sense of urgency, in my mind anyway, that we owe people in Northwest a decision one way or the other very soon, because there are enormous pressures in Northwest. And I certainly share the concerns about the impact on affordable housing, and that's something I want to try to understand better too in the next few months.
Mayor, if I could just add a comment. The one thing that I'm clearer about at the end of this hearing is I don't think the affordable housing component is a top 3 factor in this discussion. And with all due respect, I think we're in a market now that is so bullish that it's almost impossible to discern a marginal cost attributed to parking or no parking, in part because I think people are getting prices based on what they're advertising their units for because of the market dynamics and, as Chris said, scarcity. Now, the counter argument to that is the market's going to change at some point. So we shouldn't just plan for this feverish market. We should plan for the long term. We understand that, and that's, I think, a very fair point. But that for me, even though housing's, one of my core passions, that's not for me the principal driver. What I will say is that what Commissioner Fritz has in effect proposed right now is something that I deeply appreciate, because she's essentially said she will table her amendment until we have some more information to bring the council along. And that is a sign of leadership, because we can force issues and have votes that are divided, and we can have winners and losers. Or we can absorb the information we've received, which was, again, I've said it earlier, Mayor echoed it, and all of my colleagues have said it. This has been a superb hearing. Could there be a third way or a fourth way that comes out of this that we hadn't thought about? I'm reminded in the course of this hearing that when we struck the compromise on mandated parking and division, we called it an interim solution. We said we were going to revisit it during the comp plan, and we were going to look and we were going to test our assumptions. And I think we're long overdue actually taking a look at that. And we've had some compelling testimony that we may want to refine our whole proposal, because it appears to be creating incentives to do smaller scale development, which is quite contrary to our climate action plan. And if 30 becomes the dividing line where people are actually building smaller buildings because they're trying to save on the parking, that works against some of the other policies that we've adopted to get highest and best uses for our scarce land. But in effect, this is my takeaway from where we are right now. There is a proposal on shared parking which has broad support, and not even the testimony from Legacy has caused me to go against that recommendation. I was afraid he was going to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, which is the risk of testifying on something that everyone seems to agree on, and there might be some argument you bring out that causes someone to reconsider. But that's done. But this hearing has caused each of us to think about this problem in perhaps new and different ways. And I love the suggestion that there may be a kind of a hybrid new idea out there that's worth exploring to see whether it's legal. I love the idea of looking at a different way of rationing and pricing these things. Interesting ideas have percolated, and the way I read Commissioner Fritz's action right now is essentially we're tabling her amendment and bringing this whole suite of issues back to council at an appropriate time, and moving on the one matter before us that has broad support. And I deeply appreciate that approach to policymaking.
Good. Well, thank you all. Thanks for an excellent hearing. The proposal as proposed will come back to council on second reading next week. Good work. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.